Hello and welcome to GPJFF in Conversation. My name is Olivia Antsis and I'm the Executive Artistic Director of the Gershman Philadelphia Jewish Film Festival. Today I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Stephen Smith, the Finci-Viterbi Endowed Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation, about the new documentary Final Account, directed by Luke Holland. Dr. Smith, welcome to GPJFF in Conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia. It's good to be here.
So since not everyone in our audience will be familiar with your work, before we begin, I'd like to offer up a few highlights from your impressive bio. In addition to your work with the USC Shoah Foundation, making the testimony of survivors of the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity a compelling voice for education and action has led you to found the UK Holocaust Center in England, as well as the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. A theologian by training, in addition to being a professor of religion at the University of Southern California, you've also produced several documentary films, including The Last Goodbye, an award-winning virtual reality film that transports viewers inside a Nazi death camp, and The Girl and the Picture, an award-winning documentary that centers on a survivor of the 1937 Nanjing massacre in China. Holding a UNESCO chair on genocide education, Dr. Smith has lectured widely on issues relating to Holocaust and genocide. In recognition of his work, he has become a member of the Order of the British Empire and has received the Interfaith Gold Medallion. He also holds 2 honorary doctorates, an honorary Doctor of Letters from Nottingham Trent University and an honorary Doctor of Laws from the University of Leicester. Is that how you say it?
Leicester.
Yes, Leicester. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to GPJFF.
Well, thank you, Olivia.
So it's truly an honor to speak to you about this film, Final Account, an extraordinary new documentary that has documented testimonies of perpetrators of the Holocaust and witnesses to the crimes committed by the Third Reich. Can you share how you and the Shoah Foundation came to be involved in the film, and what is your role in the making of the documentary?
Well, actually, it goes back to 2008, Olivia. I was friends with Luke Holland, the filmmaker, who'd made 2 remarkable documentaries, one called Good Morning, Mr. Hitler, which actually revealed color footage from the Third Reich, from its propaganda unit that it was experimenting with in the 1930s, which Luke discovered and brought to the public's attention. And a second one called I Was a Slave Laborer, in which for a decade he followed a group of survivors who were seeking restitution for their incarceration in slave labor factories, because at that point that was not covered by German restitution law. And he followed them all the way through to their successful claim against the German government in the 1990s. So when he told me, I'm interested in interviewing former Nazis, I was very intrigued because I knew Luke's background, that his parents were refugees from Germany who'd fled to Paraguay, where he'd grown up in a German-speaking enclave, which included German expats, probably including former perpetrators after World War II. He didn't know, because it wasn't until he was in his mid-teens that he discovered that he was Jewish, when his parents came to England in order for him to finish his schooling.
Wow.
And so he just discovered all of this. So I think it was always an interest of him as a German-speaking, second-generation German Jew to say, who were these people that murdered my grandparents?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's how it started. And in 2008, he explained his project to me, that he wanted to go and find these people and talk to them, not as a documentary project, but initially as an archive project to see if he could even get them to speak. And in 2009, or maybe early 2010, he showed me the first interviews, which were remarkable, because indeed he had found the first few of them and got them to talk to him. And he said, look, I'm going to continue to film them, and then at some point there may be a documentary. And so for the last decade, I've just been following along and, liaising with him. I'm not credited on the film. It was very much his making and his doing. But I've been very much on the journey with Luke, who sadly passed away last June, shortly after finishing the film.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
Oh,
he was struggling with cancer throughout the whole period. In fact, while doing his chemotherapy and other therapies, he was traveling back and forth to Germany to find these old people and talk to them. It's a remarkable, what you don't see in the film is the remarkable act of courage that sits behind the film, which is this amazing individual who went and found these individuals and got them to speak.
wow. Yeah. I was wondering how difficult was it for him to get them to feel comfortable enough to be honest with him?
Well, that's a good question. A question of honesty. How honest are they being at any given point is one question that hangs over this film generally. What you do see there are 250 people in total that he interviewed.
Mhm.
So obviously this is a small collection. Of those 250, 25 were former SS. And so we're seeing a handful of those in this documentary. And I think he chose for this documentary those that you could follow the stream of thought from their childhood through to their old age and this sort of trajectory of their life as they look back on it. And I think of those that I've seen, I think these are generally honest individuals, even if they are saying things that are very uncomfortable for us to hear.
Mhm.
So I think that they certainly stand out from that perspective. And he got them to talk because he was able to, well, first of all, he was the most amazing, affable person that you could possibly meet. So, I found myself revealing all sorts of things to him that I would never normally do. So I think that was just his way as a documentarian. He had a great manner about him. Secondly, he, in some cases, would go back multiple times, build trust with the most difficult cases. And then sometimes it was on the second or third visit that he was successful in having them trust him enough to reveal some of their innermost thoughts.
Yeah, well, it was a remarkable feat, such an incredible accomplishment. And I heard that the Shoah Foundation is going to be archiving some of the testimonies or all the testimonies in this film. Is that true? Can you talk about that?
Yes, very interesting. I hoped when he first started the archive 10 years ago that we would bring them to the Shoah Foundation at the time. And actually, it was quite difficult for our board to come to terms with having former Nazis in the Shoah Foundation archive. And we didn't have a way at that time to to filter out things that you didn't want to see. Now, as archiving methods have progressed, actually it becomes easier to bring this archive in because in fact we can then say, I don't want to see Nazis, or I only want to see Nazis, because
Right.
filtering is much easier to do. So in fact, we're talking with Luke's widow, Yvonne, about how we bring the archive in a way that is safe. Because one of the difficult things about this archive is because they are not always telling the truth, or because they're telling a truth which is convenient to them at their point in their lives, it's not the sort of archive that you would just generally make available to the public, or, for example, to high school students. There's a lot of complexity around it. As you saw in the film, some of them are sworn followers of Adolf Hitler to this day. And so there's some danger around releasing that content generally. So the way in which we'll do it is we'll make it, we'll bring it in and we'll make sure that it's contextualized correctly and that there's a sort of an accreditation to who gets to use it and how they can in turn use that content, because we feel that it needs very carefully framing.
Yes, absolutely. And the film does a splendid job of framing each of those testimonies. But I can see how being a part of a very large index of testimonials, the context could get lost and it could be used in a way that you don't want it to be used.
Yeah, for example, there was one interview that I had fully expected Luke would include in the film, which he didn't. It's of actually a Belgian volunteer SS. And to this day, this individual is, not only, as we saw some of the individuals being, proud of their service or whatever, but really defending the Führer. I think if, a clip like that out of context was used, it could be used for quite ill, it could be used for purposes that would not square with what Holocaust education is about. In other words, it could be used to promote the Third Reich. And obviously that's not something that either Luke nor the Shoah Foundation would want to see happening. So those are the sorts of challenges that go with this. And I think that's why Luke focused on getting a documentary into the public domain to start to introduce the idea of the fact that this is 600 hours of material he collected will exist then for others to explore and learn about and learn from.
Yeah, very important information has been shared in this documentary. So I wanted to dive right into the actual documentary. The film begins with a quote by Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish poet, chemist, journalist, and survivor of Auschwitz, who wrote about his experiences in the camp throughout his life. And he wrote, and I quote, "Monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe and to act without asking questions." In final account, we hear from a number of ordinary men and women who blindly carried out orders, assuring that the whole Nazi enterprise ran smoothly. Dr. Smith, what can we learn from their testimonies and from those who witnessed their crimes but did nothing?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think Primo Levi's quote there is really pertinent. We have somewhat over the years demonized the Nazis because their deeds were in fact monstrous, and deathly in the extreme, and therefore they've taken on this monstrous caricature. But I think what this film allows us to do is take Primo Levi's point and say, actually, this was an ordinary group of human beings who made ordinary choices, the kind of which any person could make, that led to extraordinarily distressing and devastating consequences for those who became its victims. We need to try and find the human beings in the middle of this monstrous situation, because the lesson herein is that any of us, and I use that word advisedly, any of us could find ourselves faced with choices that have devastating consequences for others down the line if we do not check ourselves against those choices as we go. Now, clearly, those 10-year-olds that were putting on the uniforms, as we heard in the film, had no idea that by the time they were 22, that they would be, part of a giant criminal organization committing genocide. They were just kids that wanted to be part of a group. But I think there's a very, very serious warning in this. Let's be really clear: when we join a group or any organization or subscribe to any ideology, think about what the consequences could be. Here they are now in old age, having to reflect on that. And for me, when Luke was asking them, so are you a perpetrator? And they sort of obviously have been avoiding that question all their life, and then say, well, when you put it that way, maybe. That's the consequence of those choices that they made in their teenage years, and now they're living with it in their 90s. So that's one thing that comes out for me about the monsters, if you like. But you're right about bystanders. The old people that you see in the Ebensee old folks home when they're discussing, there they are. And I've been there, by the way. It's a beautiful, beautiful area of Austria, and Mauthausen, the terrible, terrible concentration camp with the quarry where, thousands and thousands of Jews and other prisoners were being, murdered daily just through hard labor, is right there in these beautiful hills. That lake that's behind, just right near that old people's home is a gorgeous, gorgeous space where people boat back and forward, and the Ebensee concentration camp was right there. You see there the bystander. They're implicated in it. They are trying now to justify the fact, well, we didn't know so much. Of course, my boyfriend was in SS, but I still didn't know anything. Right. I think we've got to be really clear that when history is unfolding in front of our eyes, we have to make choices about where we stand on things. And sometimes it's tough because it might cost us. But there's no excuse for just saying, well, I saw it and then shrug my shoulders and say, but there's nothing I could do. Because in fact, they saw it and they knew what the consequences of what they were seeing were.
Yeah, the range of interviewees in the documentary was very effective, because you had some people that there was a disconnect, like they understood that these were heinous crimes and they were wrong, but as the woman said, I hid my boyfriend and he was a Nazi SS officer. There was always this disconnect. But also some people are, it goes from being completely delusional about what happened to really honestly thinking and reflecting and then admitting that you were yourself a perpetrator because you didn't do anything about what you knew what was happening in your backyard.
What Luke was able to do very effectively here, I think, is you'll notice there's no experts in this documentary. Normally you have some professor of this or madam professor of that, you know, talking about some aspect of their knowledge of the Third Reich or propaganda or the Hitler. Luke didn't deploy that particular method of interview. He allowed the individuals to speak for themselves and from their experience. And he doesn't even put his own voice in there. A voice that I find is a little missing personally, but nevertheless one that he allowed them to speak themselves and to weave the narrative that way, which I think is very interesting and effective way to do it.
Yeah, and I do like when he came in and you could hear him in the background, you know, trying to get more information, you know, after they've answered the question. But speaking of, you know, formative years and childhood experience, one of the daughters of the SS officer remarked that as children, they were raised to not ask questions, to not challenge authority. And I wanted to know, is her account common among perpetrators and witnesses of the Holocaust? And does promoting independent thought play a role in parenting and Holocaust education today in Germany?
Well, so what happened in Germany after World War II, you may remember, first of all, there was a process of denazification, which was trying to ensure that the society no longer continued to believe in the goals of National Socialism. There were also some trials. They were mainly trials of major perpetrators, the 13 trials of the Nuremberg process. There were also trials in Lüneburg, in Hamburg, and then later a number of trials throughout the 50s and 60s. But it was a very, very, very small number of the people that participated that went near a courtroom. And so in a sense, Germany had to kind of come to terms with its past through education. And the route they took was largely through teaching this through history. I remember being in Jerusalem in the maybe 1991-ish. And I was in a class with a German couple. And I was totally taken aback at the point at which I was coming to learn about the Holocaust and trying to figure out what I could learn. They basically said, don't talk to us about that history anymore. We cannot take another moment of it. And the reason is that year after year through their middle and high school, they got taught about the Third Reich over and over and over again, to the point at which they were resistant to learn or to inquire or to reflect on its meaning. So I think Germany, in a way, had to kind of lock itself down. In other words, admit the past, lock down, because if they had trials, for example, for rank and file members of the SS, like we're seeing in this documentary, everybody's grandpa would have been in a courtroom somewhere. Right. So there wasn't even a provision for such individuals to be tried. You had to be a certain rank or above. That's why we've only just seen in the last few years these trials of former SS in their 90s, many of whom died before even getting to jail, because in fact, until 2009, when the John Demjanjuk trial was concluded in Germany, who was deemed to be a camp guard at the camp Sobibor, that was the first time when it actually became possible thereafter to bring rank and file Nazis that served at concentration camps, like, for example, the man who had served in Sachsenhausen, who we see in the film, might now actually be eligible. Those people were not eligible before. So it came down to education. And as you saw in the film, the second generation daughter, she basically got locked out by her father in terms of ever being able to talk about that. I think that's understandable when you're a teenager. There comes a point, and clearly this woman was in her 50s and 60s, where you would expect her to be saying, Dad, why do you have a picture of the Fuhrer on the wall? Why have you got those medals laid out in your bedroom? Can you please talk to me about that? Right. And obviously she had not had that confrontation until Luke was in the house, and it was more open. And even then you don't see her in conversation with her father. You see her and you see her father, but not the two talking together. And seems like that was too big a divide to cross. It's understandable, but obviously the issue there is then you've got a generation today growing up that are not really connected to that history and just feel the shadow and the burden of it, but actually not having that kind of sense of communication across generations.
Yeah, and there's a pivotal scene in the film, which, by the way, the structure of the film, I think, really works because beginning with these testimonies about all of the children that were kind of forced into the young folk, the German youngsters of the Hitler Youth, and then their roles in the Hitler Youth, as well as the Nazi. There's a training camp to become officers. It kind of like took you level to level until you became fully immersed in that culture and that society. But he moves from there to interviewing witnesses of Kristallnacht, including kids that were actually brought there to witness the synagogue burning. He then talks about the Bernburg Sanitarium that was converted into a euthanasia site. Then goes on to interview the child of someone who was like the registrar for a train station where the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz would come through that station, and he would have to register the trains. And then he brings this film full circle at the site of the Wannsee Conference, the site where powerful men sat in a circle drinking coffee and planning the execution of all the Jews of Europe, and literally changing the world forever. So we witnessed this highly tense but crucial discussion there between Hans Werk, who was a former SS officer, and a group of German youths who, a few of them seem a little bit reluctant about having this discussion, but, also having to navigate this inheritance of collective German guilt over Germany's role in perpetrating this mass genocide. So can you talk about that scene and why it was so important to the film?
So what I understand about this scene is that these young people were going to a technical college, which in Germany means that they were not pursuing an academic route, but were in a vocational route to start work. And one of their teachers became concerned that she was hearing things from them that made her feel that they were leaning in the wrong direction in terms of sympathy for far right policies and politics. And so she booked for them to go and visit the Wannsee house, for them to understand where these ideas lead. And that's why they were actually meeting Hans Werk, and they were there for an educational program because they already had those leanings. Interestingly, you also see some of them have their faces blanked out because they refused to sign release forms, and which is why Hans Werk is accusing them and saying, I'm here and I'm speaking to the camera. If you're so convinced about your ideas, why don't you do the same? Why are you ashamed to show your faces? So I think in a sense, it was, the most remarkable scene that this former SS is talking to German young people about not being blinded by these ideologies when, of course, exactly the same thing had happened to him. Certainly an interesting warning from history. I'm not sure how those young people got on after that, but it was a really remarkable moment to watch, the former SS warning the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And in thinking about you can't help when you're watching this film, think about the atrocities that are going on every day on American soil and around the world. And yet, we feel powerless to do anything. We have our platform on social media, but beyond that, what can we do to stop these atrocities? Is Hollander asking us as an audience to concede to a level of accountability ourselves?
Well, I think I think the whole premise of this film is that anybody can be a perpetrator. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everyone's going to join a criminal organization like the Nazis and perpetrate genocide. But in the 1930s, when these kids were signing up to these youth camps, they could not have known that, and that's not the purpose or why they became a part of it. I was very moved by Holocaust survivor Pinchas Gutter, who just recently saw this film, who said to me, after I'd survived the Holocaust and I was considering going to move to Israel, the War of Independence was ongoing, and I wanted to get there as fast as I could to participate. He said, honestly, there was a part of me that just wanted to put a uniform on and be a part of something.
Mhm.
As much as I always wanted to go to Israel, he said, and when I was listening to these young people talking about putting the uniform on, he said, I empathize with them, not because of what they did, but because of how they got there. That it was something that any of us might unwittingly do to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think therein, is a very serious warning that I think Luke is giving to us, which is you have to hold yourself accountable. Otherwise, you will ultimately be held to account. And this film called Final Account, this is not, these people never went to trial, never stood in a courtroom, but in a sense, by coming into their homes and talking to them, Luke, as the descendant of the victims of the Holocaust, is in a sense holding them to some form of account, even if it's just a handful of 250 of them. Nevertheless, he's saying, I have the final word on this. You need to account to me about your perpetration. And I think that's the lesson that he's trying to tell us all.
Thank you. And I have one last question, and I cannot thank you enough for joining us today and lending your insight into this film. What is the most important thing we as individuals and as individuals within organizations, what can we do to prevent events like the Shoah from happening again?
Well, first of all, be really careful about the choices you make. Many of the Germans that went to the polls in 1929, 30, 31, 32 were doing so after the Wall Street crash. They were thinking about their economy, they were thinking about their healthcare, they were thinking about their education, things that we all think about. And as the country went from being polarized to extremely polarized, their choices were becoming, disastrous because they were choosing things for themselves at the exclusion of others that would cost others ultimately their lives. And I think we have to be very cautious about the decisions we make, because ultimately we have to live by those decisions. The second thing is this. One of the things that you're hearing very clearly in this film is there was nobody speaking out on behalf of the Jews. Nobody said, well, I was warned, but I didn't know what to do. You just hear the deafening silence of German society. My mom and dad just took me to a career fair and I joined the SS, making it sound innocuous. Those were not innocuous choices, and nobody was speaking out, or at least if they did, they found themselves inside one of those concentration camps. And we have to have a critical mass to speak out on behalf of justice, on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves, and we can all participate in that.
Yeah, and sorry, I remembered one last question that I'm just very curious about. In the film, the director had asked one of the individuals if they knew of an account where someone who was part of this whole system as an SS officer or any functionary position said, no, I will not do this. This is wrong. If they were then put into a concentration camp, or if they suffered some kind of punishment. And the person and the director said that they have not heard of such a case in history. Was there any case where this happened?
Well, from what we know, and the urban myth around this is, if you did descend, the likelihood was that you would get sent to the front rather than to a concentration camp. They needed all the men they could get. And so you might well have become cannon fodder on the front line in the Soviet Union. I don't know of cases of individual Germans who were serving in the Wehrmacht or the SS. I don't know actually specific cases of dissent, although there are reports of that. For example, Christopher Browning in his book, Ordinary Men, when describing the Police Battalion 101 and their actions on the Eastern Front killing Jews, says that when there was dissent, in other words, when a member of the battalion refused to shoot Jews, they weren't sent to a concentration camp or dispatched to the front. They were just given alternative duties away from the actual shooting duties. But there were very few who actually did dissent. So there's a lot more to learn about that. And I think actually digging into this archive will probably reveal a lot more secrets about that, because I'm sure there'll be more that they have to say once we get into it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Thank you for your incredible work. We appreciate you joining us. And for those of you watching, if you would like to see this film and you missed our virtual screening, please check out the film at the Plymouth Meeting Mall. It's right outside of Philadelphia. It's playing. You can go into a real theater and sit in the theater and watch this film with other people and experience this incredible, monumental documentary. Thank you again, and we hope we wish all of you well, and we hope that you're safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.